Story 9. The Grand Cruise. Alaska, USA. Lucy and Jonathan were standing on a pier, their eyes wide with excitement. They were looking at a cruise ship. "That is the biggest ship I have ever seen," exclaimed Lucy. "It looks like a floating building," replied Jonathan. "We don't have a single building in our village that is as big as this ship." They stood around marveling, but it was more than just curiosity that had brought them there. The following day, Lucy, Jonathan, and their parents would be boarding the ship for a dream cruise to Alaska. The trip had been months in the planning, and now that it was finally here, they were beside themselves with excitement. Lucy and Jonathan headed back to their hotel and had a good night's sleep. The next morning, along with their parents, they took a taxi to the pier to board the ship. The taxi dropped them off at the cruise terminal, and they entered the giant building. The terminal was filled with people. First, they had to check their bags in. It would be taken directly to their room. Then they joined a long line to get their room key, followed by another long line to board the ship. They eventually made their way up the gangplank, a ramp that went from the pier to the ship's entrance. And a couple of hours after they arrived, they finally boarded the ship. A friendly crew member showed them to their cabin. Lucy and Jonathan had their own room with a balcony. They decided to explore their room later and rushed out to the main deck at the back of the ship to see the departure. Very soon, the ship started moving out of port and slowly made its way into the open sea. Once they couldn't see land anymore, Lucy and Jonathan set out to explore the ship. When they were inside, it almost felt like they were in a large building on land. The only way they could tell it was a ship at sea was when it swayed slightly and by the dull sound of the engines. There was a lot to see on the ship. It was more than 10 stories high. They wandered through the main deck that had a promenade with shops. Then it was onto the dining deck. There were several restaurants on the cruise ship, but the main dining area was where you could come for buffets. There was always a big spread for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They wandered past the theater where live shows would be performed in the evening and ended at the game arcade with all kinds of video games and fun activities. They hadn't realized how long they were gone, but rushed back to their room to meet their parents as it was time for lunch. They headed up over to the main dining area, and as they entered, their eyes lit up. It was a feast. There was everything they could imagine. Jonathan stood and stared at the dessert spread. Cakes, chocolates, brownies, and many more desserts were laid out in front of them. They grabbed their plates, loaded it up, and sat by the window looking out at sea. In the evening, they went for a magic show on board the ship and capped off the day with a quick ice cream. Then it was back to their rooms for the night. Lucy sat outside on the balcony savoring the fresh sea air before turning in. Lucy and Jonathan woke up to silence. They could not hear the ship's engines anymore, and when they drew back their curtains, they were met by the most magnificent sight. It was Alaska, just as they had seen it in the pictures. The ship seemed to be gliding alongside land with spruce trees, the occasional waterfalls, and the backdrop of snow-covered mountains. As they sat on the balcony, they even saw a grey whale. After another feast for breakfast, they joined the other passengers on the deck as the ship was going past Glacier Bay National Park. The siblings had seen a glacier before on their adventure to Iceland, but they were still amazed by what they saw. The glaciers seemed to have a life of their own as they creaked and groaned and glistened in the sunlight. Since this was a national park, there was a park ranger on board. She explained that there were mountain goats, bears, and deer in the area, in addition to the glaciers. Just then, someone shouted that the glacier was calving. As they ran along the side of the deck, they heard the ranger explain that calving meant that ice was breaking off the glacier and falling into the sea. There was a loud booming sound, and then they saw several chunks of ice fall off the glacier and into the sea. It seemed so powerful that Lucy and Jonathan were speechless as they watched. After a fun day on the cruise and feeling stuffed with all the excellent food they had eaten, Lucy and Jonathan head back to their room for the night. The next stop on the cruise was Skagway, a town in Alaska. They were excited at the thought of going out into the town to explore. Lucy sat on the bed to prepare her backpack for the next day. As she opened it, a note fell out. She had not seen it before, and it was from the magic tree. "I wonder what the magic tree has to tell us," she said as she tore open the envelope. "The bunny must have slipped the note in before we left." Lucy read the note to Jonathan. "There is a boy in Skagway who needs your help. Since you are on vacation, he will understand if you cannot help him. But if you do, then meet him under the totem pole. The password is salmon." They looked at each other. "Of course we will help him," said Lucy. "This will also be a good way to see Alaska with someone who lives here and not just as a tourist." As the cruise ship pulled into the dock, they joined the lines of passengers waiting to get out. They walked down the gangplank and were soon in the town center. There were small shops and colorful houses all around, surrounded by mist-covered peaks. "There's the totem pole!" shouted Jonathan. At the same time, they heard someone shout, "Salmon!" A boy with a large backpack approached them. He was older than Lucy and had red hair and freckles on his face. "Hello, I'm Jack. You must be Lucy and Jonathan," said the boy. "Nice to meet you, Jack," replied Lucy. "Thank you for helping me while you were on vacation," he said, while guiding them around the back of a building. Once there, he opened his backpack and a small furry head popped out. It was a bear cub. "I found this little fella while I was on a hike and he seemed to be lost, so I took him home," said Jack. "But I think he misses his mother and he hasn't eaten any food for several days. I need some help so we can reunite him with his mother." "Aren't bears dangerous?" asked Lucy. "They can be, but as long as they don't feel threatened by us, they are safe," replied Jack. We'd better get going, as we need to be back on the ship before it departs at 9 p.m., said Lucy. Our parents said we need to get back before it gets dark, added Jonathan. We're lucky that it does not get dark in Alaska during the summer, so it will be light the entire time until the ship leaves, said Jack, starting to walk towards the edge of the town. Lucy and Jonathan followed, and they were soon at the start of a trail that seemed to go up into the hills that surrounded Skagway. How do you know where to start looking? Asked Lucy as they began their climb up the trail. I have heard that there is a stream up in the hills where bears like to drink water. If we can get to that stream, we can track the bear from there, replied Jack. They climbed up the path that had trees on one side going up the hill and a drop on the other. The air was crisp, clear, and fresh. Occasionally they would come to a clearing of the trees and the sun would shine through, warming them up. Jack was used to doing this and bound up the path even though he had a small bear cub in his backpack. Lucy and Jonathan tried to keep up. As they followed Jack, the bear cub would peek out from the backpack and stare at them. Seeing the cub kept them motivated to continue. After a little while, they stopped for a break. Jack took the cub out of the backpack and they started playing with it. Jonathan pulled out a stick of chalk and tried to entertain the cub by drawing circles on the trees. It was a fun break, but they needed to keep moving. As they climbed higher, it started getting colder. The only sounds they heard were the rustling of the trees. Suddenly Jack stopped and raised his hand. He pointed to a fresh hoof print on the ground. It was a heart-shaped print, and Lucy and Jonathan could not identify the animal. "It's a moose track," said Jack. "We need to be careful. The print is fresh, so there is a moose around." "A moose will only attack if it feels threatened, so we need to keep our distance." 5 minutes after that, they heard a sound and a giant moose came down the slope and walked across the path they were on. It stopped, turned, and looked at them. It had massive antlers, and because it was cold, had steam coming out of its nostrils as it breathed heavily. They all stopped. "If the moose starts charging towards us, then it means it's threatened that we are too close. If that happens, run as fast as you can. The moose will soon stop chasing you," whispered Jack, never taking his eyes off the moose. They all stood and didn't move. Luckily, the moose then continued walking across the road and disappeared into the trees. That was a close call. If the moose had calves, then it could have been dangerous, especially if we came between the mother and her calves, said Jack, breathing a sigh of relief. They continued on their journey along the path, eventually coming to the stream. There, they took the bear cub out of the backpack and put it down on the ground. "We need to let the cub wander off by itself. That way, the mother bear might pick up its scent. I'm sure she's somewhere close by trying to find her cub," said Jack. The three of them left the bear cub by the stream and hid behind the trees. Eventually, the cub started wandering off by itself. Then it started running on all fours. Lucy, Jonathan, and Jack followed it. The cub ran through the trees surprisingly fast. I think it smells its mother, said Jack. We need to be careful if the mother is around. The cub eventually ran into a clearing in the woods. It was a small grassy area that was surrounded by trees. Jack was about to enter the clearing when he saw the mother bear come out from the trees on the other side. He instinctively stopped and raised his hand for Lucy and Jonathan to stop as well. Lucy saw his raised hand and stopped beside him. Jonathan did not and ran ahead into the clearing. Lucy and Jack looked on in horror as the mother bear stopped and stared at Jonathan, who also stopped frozen in his tracks. Luckily, the bear cub ran up to its mother. She got distracted and started playing with it. Jonathan, you need to slowly walk backwards towards us, whispered Jack. Don't run or make any sudden moves. You'll be okay. Jonathan walked backwards as slowly as he could, resisting the temptation to turn around and run away. Once he got out of the clearing and into the trees, Lucy hugged him. Then the three stood for a little while and watched the mother bear happily reunited with her cub. The wind is blowing away from the mother bear, so she cannot smell us. If the wind changes direction, she will smell us and know we are here. We better get moving, said Jack. They started making their way through the trees, but after wandering around for a little while, they realized they were not near the path they came on. I think we are lost, said Jack with a worried look on his face. Following the bear cub took us away from the trail. Let's keep moving. Hopefully we can find the trail, replied Lucy. It's 7:15 p.m., so we still have enough time before the ship leaves, said Jonathan. You are the only one of us who has a watch, so you need to keep track of the time, replied Lucy. They wandered around through the trees, trying to find the path that would lead them back to town. As time went by, they started getting worried. Eventually, they came across a few abandoned log cabins. Whose cabins are these? Asked Jonathan. Over 100 years ago, there was a gold rush in the Klondike region of Canada, replied Jack. Thousands of people made their way there in the hopes of finding gold. To get there, they had to travel on this path through Skagway. These are some of the cabins that people stayed at on their journey in search of gold. I wonder if we should plan on camping here for the night. We will be safe in these cabins. No, we need to find our way back to the town. If we do not make it back in time, the ship will leave without us and we will be stranded in Skagway, replied Lucy. Jonathan wasn't listening. He stopped and stared straight ahead, his eyes wide with excitement. Do you see that? He asked. What is it? Is it a bear? Asked Lucy, worried. No, it's a chalk mark, said Jonathan, running forward. He stopped in front of a tree and pointed to a line drawn with chalk. When we were following the bear cub, I started making these chalk lines on the trees. I made them as we walked along. Now we just need to follow these lines back to the path, said Jonathan proudly. That is amazing. I see another line, exclaimed Jack as he ran ahead. Jonathan had saved the day. They followed the lines Jonathan had made on the trees and eventually found their way to the path. They did not know how long it would take them to get back to the ship, so they started running. The path was slippery and had been easier to climb up than to go down. Jack could move faster than Lucy and Jonathan, so he would run ahead and then wait for them to catch up. They finally reached the outskirts of the town. Jonathan checked his watch. "We have plenty of time," he said confidently. Relieved, they started walking slower, catching their breath. They were glad this adventure was over and were looking forward to the rest of their cruise. They started saying goodbye to Jack, who handed them a small packet. "What is it?" asked Lucy as she opened the packet. "It's a small piece of gold I found by the river. It's not worth too much, but it will remind you of your time in Alaska," replied Jack with a wink. They were thrilled with the little gold nugget that Jack had given them and carefully put it into their backpack. The three of them strolled through the town towards the cruise ship. Then they heard the ship's horn. Jack stopped. "What time is it?" he asked. "That horn blows when the ship is ready to leave." Jonathan, the only one with a watch, checked the time. "Don't worry, it's only 7:15 p.m. We have plenty of time," he said. Lucy slowly turned towards Jonathan, then grabbed his arm and looked at his watch. "Jonathan, you said it was 7:15 p.m. a long time ago. Your watch has stopped," she shouted. "Excuse me, sir," Lucy shouted to a man passing by. "What time is it?" "It's 8:50 p.m., replied the passerby. "There is no way we can make it to the ship on time," said Jonathan, holding his hand up to his head. They could see the cruise ship, but because it was so large, it appeared closer than it was, and they knew that even if they ran, they would not make it on time. They only had 10 minutes. The thought of getting stranded in Skagway was suddenly on their minds. "I have an idea," shouted Jack as he darted into a nearby shop. He came out a little later with a great-looking cycle meant for 2 people to ride. "This is a tandem bicycle. It belongs to my friend who has a shop here," said Jack. "The 2 of you can make it to the ship on time if you cycle there. Leave the cycle by the entrance. I'll pick it up later." Lucy and Jonathan jumped on the cycle. It took them a little getting used to, but in no time they were pedaling furiously down the pier. As they got closer, they could see the last passengers board the ramp that led to the ship's entrance. They knew that once the ramp was pulled away, there was no way for them to board the ship. As they got closer, they saw someone start to move the ramp away. Both Lucy and Jonathan started shouting at the top of their voices. At first, the person pushing the ramp did not hear them. Then he turned. It worked. He held the ramp open for them a minute longer, but that was all the time they needed. They came to a screeching halt at the end of the ramp. They jumped off the cycle and left it on the ground for Jack to pick up later. Then they scrambled on board the ship. They had made it back on time. The end. Here are some fun facts on Alaska. You can find these fun facts in the fun fact section of the website. Alaska is the 49th state in the United States of America. The capital of Alaska is Juneau. The Alaska state flag was designed by a 13-year-old boy named Benny Benson. His design was selected in a contest held in 1927. You cannot access Juneau, the state capital of Alaska, by road. It can only be accessed by sea or air. Alaska is the largest US state. It is over twice as big as Texas, which is the next largest state. Of the 20 highest mountains in the United States of America, Alaska has 17 of them. One of them is Denali, which is the highest mountain in North America. Alaska was purchased by the US from Russia in 1867. Many people at that time thought it was a mistake to buy Alaska. And finally, Alaska is the only state name you can type on one row of the keyboard. Try it out. That's it. See you all next week.